Hello and welcome to EXP Required, where we talk about Final Fantasy and other things. I'm Jack, and I'm as always joined by Mole. How are you doing, Mole?
I'm not too bad, actually. It was recently pointed out to me that I do give a little weather report at the beginning of every single one of our episodes, so I'm not going to disappoint today. At time of recording, it's really, really warm. I'm not enjoying it too much, and it's only set to get warmer, so whoop-de-doo. Hopefully by the time that this comes out, it'll be a bit cooler, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
It is hotter than the sun in the UK. It's
no exaggeration,
literally
hotter than the sun.
And you Americans that complain that the heat is not real heat need to come and live here for a bit, because my god, the humidity here, man, is all I'll say.
Have we just alienated our American audience?
You can delete that later if you want.
Viewers anyway, down by one.
You beautiful Americans that listen to our podcast might not fully appreciate the full British summer. It may not be as hot on a scale. We use Celsius, you use Fahrenheit. It's up to you if you want to use that, but I don't understand it, never have. But, you know, whatever. It's a different type of heat, you know? You have your own problems, we have our own problems.
It's a dry
Let's just all be
heat,
friends.
man.
Yeah,
it's
definitely,
not fucking dry heat here, I'll tell you that much.
No, absolutely. Okay, so today we are going to be speaking about a game we've spoken about several times before and have shared our love for several times before. Final Fantasy VIII. I think this was like a joint idea we had almost at the same time to go back to this game in a bit more detail, because we spoke about this in detail in our very first episode, talking about the golden era.
Yeah, but we realised that we didn't really go into that much detail about it. The space was shared with Final Fantasy VII and 9, and we kind of thought, okay, well, we've talked about it a bit more at length with our good friend May, but we didn't really get the chance to go into it a bit deeper ourselves, so what better time than now?
And we've gotten way better at this now, and we've covered some more bases with some recent episodes, so I thought we would talk about the development and some of that stuff a little bit as well, which we've never really spoken about. So, first to start, let's talk about this game's release. Final Fantasy VIII originally came out on February the 11th, 1999, on the PlayStation 1 in Japan. It came out later that year on September the 9th, 1999 in North America, October 27th in Europe, and then October 29th in Australia for some reason, 2 days later. I don't know why they got it a couple of days later.
Australia, they're always getting the short end of the stick.
And then the PC version came out in North America on the 26th of January 2000, so not long after at all, and then in Europe on February the 18th, 2000, and then in Japan on March the 23rd, 2000, so that's, like, as far as I know, may very well be the first Square Enix title that came out in Japan last. Don't know, we'll have to research into that, but it's interesting how it's kind of like almost in reverse order, how the Japanese got the PC version last. And then, as we did discuss with our friend May, this did not get a re-release until 2019, so 19 years later, more than 19 years later.
And there was a reason for that.
Yes, yeah, it's something to do with the fact that the source code was lost for the game, and it was a bit of a faff to release, and all this stuff. It seemed to fall through the cracks in releases. I think it was before the merger with Square Enix, and I think from what I understand, that just so happened this game fell through the cracks and was lost. Don't know the ins and outs of it.
I mean, as I understand it, I recently read, and I haven't verified this, so whether or not it's true is a completely different matter, but I did read that, obviously, Final Fantasy Tactics has been remade for the Evilist Chronicles. It's been remade from the ground up using the same graphics, but again, they lost the source code for that, and I did also read recently that apparently the same fate ended up happening to the original Kingdom Hearts game, so, like, this kind of feels like it's an ongoing issue with Square Enix.
Maybe.
Don't really know what to say about that, other than very disappointed, because it's not really a good look losing the source code to your game, is it?
Wow, maybe not, but I just think it's interesting how this game seems to be the only one that's suffered the most. Oh, the only one that suffered the most, the one that suffered the most, because Kingdom Hearts has been remade 8 million zillion billion times. Tactics has been remade twice now, so come on, get on with it, Square. Let's have a Final Fantasy VIII remake of some form. But the date was September 23rd, 2019, on PS4, PS5, PC, Switch, and Xbox One worldwide. All at the same time, and then on March the 24th, 2021, on phone, so on Android and iOS. So, yeah, so quite interesting that there was 19 years between releases. It's quite an interesting one, because a lot, like we just said, like a lot of other releases are, you know, they're peppered through the years, Game Boy Advance releases, PlayStation stuff releases. I guess technically there were releases of, like, PlayStation Classic stuff on, like, PS3, so that you could play a port of the PS1 game.
I don't really
you could
count
argue.
those.
Don't really count that. It's just another way to play the same game, to be honest with you. Whatever. It wasn't a change of anything in any capacity, other than the fact that it probably loads a bit quicker. So, we've talked about it before, but do you want to go through your personal memories of this game, just to reframe it for everyone?
Yeah, so obviously we spoke about this before in our very first episode. If you haven't listened to it, I don't blame you, because the audio quality is middling at best.
My bad.
But I was 6 at the Christmas of 99, and by some incredible twist of fate, I opened my present, which had a PS1 and Final Fantasy VIII inside it. And my father still says to date that this is one of his favourite memories of me looking up and being like, is this really for me? Because I just couldn't believe that I had a PS1. I could play Final Fantasy for myself. I'd been dreaming of it for like a couple of years at this point, just by myself. So that was Christmas of 99 for me, sitting down and playing it, and I think I got up to the Dollet mission at the bottom of the communications tower, and I saved at the very bottom of the lift, and that was it for that day. Like, turn it off, we're having Christmas dinner now. But the sound effect of the feet on the metal inside the communications tower is like the most nostalgic sound in gaming to me for that reason alone, honestly. It makes me think of Christmas every time.
That's fabulous. I mean, I have a similar Christmas memory from getting the game, but my memory I talked about a lot is my first exposure to this game was through the FF8 guidebook in school. So a friend of mine had the guidebook. You remember we had like a bring in a book to read day at school and stuff like that?
Oh, you brought in guidebooks too, huh?
Yeah, kids brought in guidebooks and stuff like that. And he brought in the Final Fantasy VIII guidebook. I was like, what is this? And he's like, you got to play it, man. Eventually I went around his house. Don't remember the exact timeline, but I remember, as I've talked about before as well, the official PlayStation Magazine issue 44, which I hid behind some fish magazines and my newsagents because I didn't want anyone else to buy it, even though it was months after it had come out. For some reason, that issue just so happened to stay on the shelf.
It's mine!
I remember, like, I'd already had issue 46 by that point because it was the Star Wars issue. So, like, I don't know why it was in the shop so long. Perhaps it was fate. And in there, it talks about it's like an early release of Final Fantasy IX that they've played the Japanese version. Played around his house, and he was at the missile base and he had all three girls there, which is a standard thing that speedrunners use because it's quicker to do with for some reason. But regardless, like, it seems to be canon to me in my head that the three girls go to the missile base now, and then the three guys go to Balam when you choose to split the party. We fought some Bell Helmels, which I've struggled to pronounce since then. So like Bell Helmels, Bell Helmels are like the saw things that go like that, and they scare the living shit out of me. But Bell Helmels or Behelmels or whatever you want to call them. And then Wendigos, and I remember thinking this is really, really cool. I remember thinking it was a Pokemon for grown-ups, and then when he showed me the Diablos summon.
Sorry, Pokemon for grown-ups in Final Fantasy VIII. That's a beautiful mental image.
Pokemon for grown-ups, and the fact that he summoned Diablos, and I mean, like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my absolute life. It was the coolest thing. I mean, even now, if you look at that summon, it is an absolutely beautifully animated piece of whatever you want to call it. And I thought, I have to have this game. Wanted it for months, and it was really expensive at the time for an 8-year-old, and not stocked in a lot of places from memory, so like they didn't have it everywhere. I remember going into a shop near me called Game Exchange. They didn't have Final Fantasy VIII, but they had a Vagrant Story, and he was like, do you want this one instead? And I was like, I don't want that rubbish instead. Which is
I know people that would crucify you for that one.
Another interesting thing to consider, and I think you've said before, I think it was on maybe when we spoke to Amy Mallet about how Final Fantasy X, the back of the box, is nostalgia for you.
Yes, big time.
The back of the Final Fantasy VIII box with the Squall's face is extremely nostalgic for me. It makes me very happy to read that book. And I got it for Christmas 2000, so probably a year after you from what you've said. And I've also written here, I remember getting to the spider over the Christmas holiday, so I have a nostalgic memory of the Dollet mission. It felt like it was mine because my friend hadn't shown me that part.
Right.
And I remember having this feeling that this was kind of like one of those things you've looked forward to for so long. But then when you get it, it's everything you wanted and more. It
actually lives up to the hype, yeah.
It absolutely lived up to the hype, because I remember like doing that mission, like playing it in my front room, because obviously like over the Christmas period, like I could play the game in the living room for a bit, and that was the coolest thing in the world. And then eventually it was up to my room to play it. But I remember in the living room on the big TV, which is probably about half the size of the TV I have myself now, playing that and just seeing the animation of doing the Renzo Kuken against the Evolrat boss and being like, this is the future of my life.
Yeah.
So absolutely brilliant.
And now look at you.
It was also a present I got, as we used to have like a special present that we got as like a secret one that we wanted.
Oh, that's cute.
And I remember not getting it, and there's actually a video of me, not of opening it, but there's a video of me like looking to my conservatory going, there's something else, isn't there? And that actually exists somewhere. So yeah, that's worth considering as well. So yeah, no, brilliant game. Pokemon for grown-ups. That's definitely the way I describe Final Fantasy VIII, you know?
Is that the draw system, Pokemon for grown-ups, then?
More the summons than anything, I think. The fact that you were collecting GFs, because I thought the fact that he'd got some of the GFs, but he hadn't got all of them, I thought you've got to go and catch them, you know?
I've just realised that the real comparison here is that Pokemon for grown-ups in this universe is just triple triad, isn't it? It's card collecting.
Yeah, a very interesting framing that, because obviously this came out around the same time that Pokemon was a massive craze worldwide.
Yes.
They clearly tapped into something there with the card game. I think, the 90s kind of collect everything from bags of crisps and stuff like that.
To be fair,
the card
they did
game.
a fucking good job with it. I know all we ever do is talk about how good Triple Triad is on this podcast, but fuck me, it's a really good game.
It is. If they'd released Triple Triad as its own game without Final Fantasy as its framing, it probably would have done well at its own anyway.
Yeah, I can see it. Just decent artwork, maybe a couple of extra rules in there. Yeah, I can see that having done well.
Yeah. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about the game's release, which we've not really touched upon that much over the years. So, anecdotally, this is one of those things where, and we've talked about them losing the source code, but sometimes it's quite difficult in this era to work out information about release and, press releases and stuff like that. We talked a lot about this sort of thing when we spoke to May in the Final Fantasy Versus 13 episode about, nowadays and certainly even 10, 15 years ago, these things were common because they were filmed and you could see them and you could see all the press releases. They were released on the internet, that kind of stuff. Back in 97 to 99, it wasn't that commonplace you saw this kind of stuff. I could only find anecdotally that the development of this game started while Final Fantasy VII was being localized for non-Japanese audiences. That's the only note I have on when it was being developed. I'm sure there's some more to it, but that's literally the only source I've got. But I do know that this was showcased at E3 1998. Video footage in E3 98 is very limited, but there's an article from E3 written by someone called Ken Gagney, which is published in something called Video Gaming Central. Don't know if that's a website, don't know if that was a magazine, but it's certainly an archive if it exists online, where he talks about an FF8 trailer, which is an early FMV of the Dollet mission. Now, he describes it through, and he says, I've got the quote, "We watched as 7 figures streaked across a full moon sky, and the title faded in, all of which then faded out to show a fleet of sleek warboats approaching a shore. Squall squinted his face against the sun, which made the scar running from above his right eye to below his left eye all the more apparent. We watched as covert stormtroopers attacked a monster, a robot locked onto a target, and Leviathan was summoned to work his aquatic magic." Well, the 7-figure streak is basically across the moon. It's the Dollet landing, at the beginning of the landing, where you see the boats come across the landing.
Yeah.
Because the clip he's describing is essentially a trailer that was included in a Parasite Eve disc as part of a collection disc. So it was basically it's the E3 trailer, and it's just like clips of the early footage. If you remember, or you may not know, the early footage they produced for this game was for the Dollet landing stuff and running away from the spider, which included Renoa and all of the seeds in their full outfits.
Yes.
So the footage of Squall is him in his black coat. Now, that little bit of footage, that trailer, for want of a better term, was included on the second disc along with Parasite Eve, which was I think it's the FF8 or the Square Enix collection disc, which has a few other things on it as well. So I don't know for certain, but he's describing the footage. It matches pretty much what that footage is. Also has a track called Visions of Dollet, which doesn't appear anywhere in the final game. So, yeah, a little bit of an extra thing, which is like a little bit of music that does sound very Nobuo, but not quite Nobuo.
Jack, I know that you've tracked down every single iteration of the Dollet mission possible that exists in the world. Do you have this? The FF collections that came with the Parasite Eve?
I do. So I bought Parasite Eve as the discs. I didn't get the fully boxed version because I was broke at the time, but I do have the 2 collector's discs. There's a first collector disc which has that trailer on it, and I think a few other things. I think there's Brave Fensu Musashi trailer or video. There's a Xenogears playable trailer. And the second disc, which came with Brave Fensu Musashi itself, includes the trial version of Final Fantasy VIII, which includes the actual Dollet mission you can play with Renoa. That demo was also released, I think, in Burger King or McDonald's or something like that in the States. And then the demo we got was a much later build of the game, which is pretty much exactly what's in the final game with a few differences.
Right, okay.
So, yeah, the pretty much the main demo for this game was the Dollet mission. Worth mentioning, obviously, there, it talks about Leviathan. It's quite interesting that every early version of this game contains Leviathan, as far as I know.
Really?
There was this big push for the beauty of the Leviathan summon, which is fascinating to me because, of course, you don't get Leviathan in the main game until
quite late, yeah.
Well, you draw him from Norg, and it's quite interesting because Leviathan doesn't really feature at any point in the story.
No.
Whereas Ifrit does,
Yeah, the summons that actually feature in the story are very far and few between. There's a couple of moments where you can see the connection between the summon and the person that you would draw it from. I'm thinking specifically here of Fujin and Pandemona. Yeah. But yeah, Leviathan and Norg seems very... okay, sure. Having said that, the Leviathan summon is one of my favourite summons in 8. It looks fantastic. I can absolutely understand why they would use that to show off the graphical fidelity of this game. But yeah, in Dollet, that's very strange. Maybe they were trying to summon the Dollet Bay to overwhelm the Galbadians.
Maybe. I don't really know. It's really interesting. It'd definitely be worth digging into a little bit of that. But it's just interesting how Leviathan was such a big part of the early game's marketing, but then became kind of like an
afterthought.
Afterthought almost. I mean, graphically, most of the summons in this game are beautiful, but That you've obviously got the brothers who, I mean, a lot of these GFs are optional, but like even if you go and find the brothers, that they have a little bit of a story that ties them in.
Yeah.
Diablos, you talk about, who disturbs my sleep. Eden, you get at the bottom of the deep sea research facility. Okay, there's not much story there, but like you kind of get the impression that Eden's this secret weapon they were working on.
And Bahamut in the deep sea research facility as well.
There's narratives for some of these characters, but Leviathan's probably out of all of them is one of the ones that doesn't really have any connection at all. So, which is bizarre considering the fact how big a part of the marketing this was. If you look at all of the footage I found from around the time of E3, where British and French and God knows how many different gaming outlets were talking about this game, they use the footage of Leviathan as B-roll. It's actually considered part of the B-roll at E3 1999, which was a year later, which we'll get into in a second.
Interesting about that as well, like specifically, you're the game collector guy, I'm the figure collector guy. There is a set of cold cast statues that were put out by Kota Bukiya back in, I want to say 99 or 2000. They are exquisitely rendered statues, they're absolutely gorgeous. I've never seen them go for under like 1,500 each, which is a real shame because they're really, really nice and I would love to have all of them. It features the characters from the games and a section of a summon beast, or a GF, with them as well. And Leviathan actually gets his due in this. Leviathan is modelled alongside Quistis and Selphie, and it's a really nice looking statue, but Selphie looks like her dress is about to fall off, so it's simultaneously really nice and also a bit like, is she okay? Does she need some help there? Also in the lineup is Zell and Irvine are featured with Diablos. Renoa is featured with Siren, and that's a gorgeous statue. I think that's one that I've seen the most images of. Oh, I want that one so bad. Squall is featured with Bahamut, because why wouldn't he be? And, of course, Sifa is featured with Odin. None other than.
Of course, yes.
I think those are probably some of the rarest pieces of FF8 merch. Not that there was a huge amount of FF8 merch, but they are definitely the priciest that I've seen. I would so dearly love to have them. If anyone's out there listening and they love me very, very much, get in contact.
Yeah, I think the other two things that jump to mind has been extremely rare. The other three things that jump to mind has been extremely rare in some form are the fucking official PlayStation magazine issue from 1999 in the UK with the fucking FF8, which is a fucking nightmare to get hold of. We'll get to that at some point.
Yeah, you've been struggling, haven't you?
The Moomba mug,
yes.
Which is quite rare. It's not that expensive. It's still hundreds of quid, but it's not like the Galbadian jersey.
I saw a post about the Galbadian Bears jersey once, and it was like, it had already sold years before, and I think the final selling price was like $700 at the time, and it was like, Jesus Christ, people spend that much on merch.
Yeah, and now look at us. Anyway, that's interesting. I didn't really know about those figures. I know that there were figures with these characters and stuff like that. I didn't know about the summons. That's really interesting. It does seem a little bit like Selphie makes sense with Leviathan, because Selphie has that weapon layer on that's like the old, the Sahagin. I probably pronounced that wrong. They've got like the trident.
Yes.
Right, so like that could very well be the, maybe
Strange
an early
Vision, isn't it?
I don't know what it's called. I think it certainly is a trident. It might be Strange Vision. But the point is that maybe they were going for a whole... Each of these monsters corresponds to each of the characters, like they did eventually with Final Fantasy XIII, a very Digimon approach if they tie in with the character's personality, which ended up coming full force in Final Fantasy XVI later.
I can see that.
Maybe that's what they were going for.
I'd be interested to have a look at the compatibility ratings between the GFs, like those specific GFs and the characters within the game. I haven't actually done that before. Why has that never occurred to me before?
I'm just amazed that this has come out of nowhere, this conversation, because I didn't plan for it. That's just the coolest thing in the world, and that's what we do best. So yeah, no, I do think it was interesting that Leviathan, again, honestly, you wouldn't believe, like, it's part of every single little conversation piece everyone's talking about it or showing off the B-roll of Leviathan. They were really pushing Leviathan as probably the first summon that they programmed into the game.
That's really interesting. I had no idea.
I don't know if that's for certain, if it is the first summon that was programmed in, but it's just amazing how, like, he's, such a big part of that marketing. But
really
then
not. Wow.
You don't even have to bother with Leviathan. He also appears in the PC demo of the game. So the PC demo is slightly different than, it's a lot different than the Dollet mission. It's not the Dollet mission, it's actually the segment from when you go and fight the Grinaldo and the Raldo in the training center with Quistis.
Right,
so
okay.
It's your Midnight Rendezvous is the demo for the PC version, and the summon you get there is Leviathan as well.
Right.
So even as late as we described above, slightly later into 2000, they were still pushing Leviathan in some way as part of the early game.
That's really strange, because the original game would have already come out at that point.
Already come out. It's absolutely, it's really, really interesting to me how at some point somewhere someone decided let's drop Leviathan or let's not bother with Leviathan. You know, that's its own topic all on its own.
Yeah, I'm starting a conspiracy theory. Who's with me?
What happened to Leviathan,
Yeah.
the deep sea monster, from the Deep Sea Research Facility? Perhaps it was something to do with that. Who knows? Now, that was a segment from E3 1998. Now, what I find interesting about this thing from Ken Gagne is also that in that spiel, he talks about Squall. He doesn't say this character. Clearly, Squall was already known as a name, so there's probably earlier marketing for this in some magazines from 98 that exist to dig into at some point, but this is kind of the first... This is only anecdotal from someone making a quote from E3 1998. There's no footage of E3 98 I can find, but there is loads of E3 footage from 1999. So we've already touched upon some of that stuff with some of the B-roll that was clearly sent to PRs and whatever back in the day, that a lot of it was around this Leviathan footage. There's quite a lot of footage from Dollet, as you can imagine. There's also, I think there's a fight going on with the old Geli, whatever they're called, the things you fight in Centra. There's random
those
footage.
like ice thingy.
The weird things that do morph and change their bodies.
Yeah, right, okay, yeah.
So they appear in some of this early footage. Now, you'll like this from you've talked in the past about translation quirks and stuff like that. Bearing in mind the timeline for this game's release. So E3 1999 was held on the 13th of May to the 15th of May 1999. So it was just after the Japanese release, before the international release. So Square's E3 presence was significant, with a tower featuring the Galbadian symbol that appears on the Delling City Arch, the Galbadian national symbol, with a full-size figure of a deer with the whole, the wings thing inside.
As a statue in the game?
Like a proper... No, so the idea is there was a tower there, you could climb up the tower, there's a staircase with the old framing of the Delling City Arch, and that was the square tower to go in and have a look, right?
Ah, okay.
Right. Coolest thing in the world. There's quite a little bit of footage around about it, and inside that tower you can see a life-size model of a deer. That's something you'd probably see in like a blockbuster back in the day, of maybe a 6 foot or whatever figure of a character, something that I'd love to have in my room now, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's never going to happen. Now, there's also a cinema area. Now, I have no idea what the cinema area was, but it showed off a short film called Enter the World of Heroes. Have I talked to you about this before?
No, this is the first I've ever heard of this.
So Enter the World of Heroes, I've got the clip because some very, very kind soul has filmed the entire thing on their camcorder, had the entire Enter the World of Heroes marketing clip, which is basically a clip from upcoming Square games like Chocobo Racing, Final Fantasy VIII, the PS1 version of Final Fantasy VI, and there's a couple of other things in there as well that are interesting to look at. Now, so I have that whole footage of that thing there that was shown in like a cinema. It's one of those things that's on a rolling thing. You go in, you sit down, you look at all these trailers and then pop out. I've no idea where it was on the sort of the shop floor, so to speak, but that was clearly part of Square's overall marketing. Really, really interesting.
That's cool.
There's some translation quirks that are apparent throughout all the marketing, including E3. So, as part of one press coverage, they call President Delling President Daring. Evil President Daring, which is fascinating because this is while the game's being localized. So clearly it's something they got the press have been given, right?
Yeah.
And in the World of Heroes segment, Renoa is part of Forest Owl. So it's not
Singular.
Forest Owls, it's Forest Owl.
Okay.
I think it's Edia, they call Adia as a pronunciation. So they also had booths where they have the game playing. So they had footage of Final Fantasy VIII playing in English.
Okay.
So you can see at this date, between 13th and 15th of May, there is footage of the game playing in English. It's the Diablos fight, and they use the Curaga strategy. So they use the strategy where the Curan use Demion on him, and he uses Curaga on them. That's a quirk in the game where if you basically use his magic against him, he'll cure you. So that was clearly something that the developers knew about, or certainly the people on the shop floor showing people how to play it knew about. That kind of creates some evidence that maybe that was something that was deliberately programmed into the game. It's always been up for discussion whether or not that was a glitch of some form, but why would Diablos cure you? It seems to me, my opinion has always been that Diablos cures you because you've discovered his secret on how to beat him, and it is a deliberate act.
Interesting.
I don't really know, though. But that is something that is literally shown off in the footage that I have of someone, literally some nice guy with a camcorder filming the screen, which is brilliant. Now, there's also Japanese footage of the PC version playing at the time, because as you know, and I've said before, the PC version came out not long afterwards, within a year.
Yeah.
And the segment is Squall, Sifa, and Zell fighting the Ruby Dragon on the fourth dream sequence of Laguna. The old cliff area where you find the Ruby Dragon, which, as far as I'm aware, you can't get in the game anyway. It must have been Game Sharked in or something that they'd used the engine to create.
I mean, you can go back to that area and fight dragons there. I know
but never with Sifa.
Oh, with Sifa, of course, yeah.
Yeah. So it's something that's clearly been programmed into the game as probably like a rolling demo of some form, which I think is fascinating.
God, I'm also just imagining what the Dollop mission would have ended up like if Squall, Sifa, and Zell had to fight a fucking dragon instead of just a bunch of regular guys. Imagine that as your final exam. Here's a dragon, good luck. Oh, cheers, headmaster.
I mean, it could very well have been maybe something they were considering, because obviously that fourth dream where Laguna fights the dragon is where Sifa got his idea how he held his gunblade.
True.
It could be that they went back there of some form. Don't know. It's very interesting how these games seem to be developed concurrently, the PC version and the PlayStation version, and you can see crossover and how they were developed. Very interesting to me. So that's pretty much all the gist. There was obviously also the PS2 ballroom footage of Squall and
You've talked
Rinoa.
about this before, yes.
So I don't know for certain this was at E3. I've not got any first-hand footage to show it was, but basically the ballroom footage, which in itself as a CG cutscene in the PS1 version was mind-blowing enough, they actually rendered it on PS2 hardware and showed it off on the PS2 reveal in an event in March 1999 in Tokyo. I don't know for certain if it was shown off at E3, but everything else that was shown at that PS2 launch event was, so there's no reason to say it wouldn't be. Why wouldn't they want to show off the beautiful footage, considering the fact that Final Fantasy VIII was there? Probably the reasons why it hasn't appeared at the PS2 booth, potentially, because basically they had a PS2 booth where it was on the top of a pyramid at the Sony area, and they were showing off a rolling demo of the model walking down the catwalk and penguins and all the stuff that showed off on the early PS2 hardware. They could show it off. There's a bit of Ridge Racer that was playing as well.
Racer!
That was a bit later, but yeah, one of the Ridge Racer bits. But one of those pieces of footage was the Rinoa and Squall ballroom scene as part of the PS2 reveal event. But it kind of makes sense to me why that wasn't shown in the pyramid area for Sony, because it's clearly something that Square wanted to keep as theirs. So either it wasn't shown at E3 or it was shown elsewhere, and that just someone's never captured footage of it.
Right. That's going to be your eternal bugbear, isn't it? Just not knowing for sure.
Never been confirmed it was there, other than a lot of people assuming it was. It probably was, but I'm always one of these people that wants to know for certain, so that might never be answered unless we can get hold of someone.
Evidence. I like it.
It's an absolutely fascinating piece in history, because the fact this game was being developed for a different platform, i.e. the PC, at the same time that it was being localized. I think it's fascinating that they had an entire segment of the game that could be played in English, and that's probably where the sort of translation quirks came from. It's clearly a very early stage in that localization development, and they probably came up with something very quickly, maybe a quick segment of the game to be able to play so that English people could play the game. From I think it's one of the marketing pieces from one of the pieces that reported on this game, they were saying how much it was way better in English. So clearly there's a significant portion of the game to be played in English than in Japanese, because of course a lot of games journos would have been playing the imported version at this point, which a lot of magazines did. The aforementioned OPM Volume 43 obviously did that, but the fact that he had a journo saying, oh yeah, it's better in English, shows that clearly that was a big part of the event, which I think is fascinating as well.
That's really, really interesting, and especially around that time. I mean, I know the battle rages eternal, but back in the day, subs v dubs was like the biggest fucking deal you could imagine. So I bet that probably simultaneously both really pleased and really pissed off a lot of people.
Maybe. It's also worth noting that a lot of the people in the early marketing said how much better this was than Final Fantasy VII, which is quite funny.
Really?
Considering how that debate's never ended.
Oh boy.
But I mean, at the time, there is no denying how this graphically looked significantly better than Final Fantasy VII did. It was such a huge step up. At the time, we had 1997's big graphical powerhouse was Final Fantasy VII. 98, probably the graphical powerhouse was Metal Gear Solid. And then this came out and wiped the floor with a pair of them. Even the fact that they were showing off, as part of this marketing, they were showing off the bit where the cutscenes interact with the character models.
Yeah.
There's a section of Sifa coming out of the Dollet landing craft straight out of a cutscene. That's stuff they were showing off at this point.
It's not seamless, not in the way that we'd consider it today, but that's still really cool even now to me.
Yeah, probably the very first time, because it's a lot of people that were E3 that weren't necessarily journalists or whatever would have seen. I don't know. I know that certain years of E3 only let journalists in, and certain people. I don't know exactly the history of that and what the case was with this setup, but yeah, it's interesting that not everyone that was on that show floor, I should say, looking at the early footage would have seen that before. and they would have probably had their mind blown by it. So the early reaction to Final Fantasy VIII, from what I can see, was almost universally positive. That's something to consider, because of course it gets reinvented over time that this game was always considered bad in some way, or that there seems to be a perception from a lot of people that people were like, oh, it's not going to be as good as the one I like. There's always going to be people like that, but from what I can see, certainly from a journalistic perspective, people were really looking forward to this. Maybe they were disappointed with it later because it wasn't the same as the game they liked, but the hype for this was absolutely astounding, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I can also really understand that from a gamer's perspective too, of, wow, Final Fantasy VI was really, really good, and Final Fantasy VII was really, really good. Final Fantasy VIII's going to be really good as well. Like, yeah, of course you'd be excited. You just had arguably the biggest PS1 game of all time just released. Like, it's something that changed the gaming landscape for, like, the rest of your lifetime. And then, not the sequel, but, like, the next iteration comes along. You're going to be hyped no matter what. Like, at this point, Squaresoft as a company was kind of incapable of doing wrong. Everything that they put out was a really heavy hitter. Compare that to, like, the marketing and the gaming sphere these days, and it's less that Square Enix does wrong where Squaresoft didn't, but more the choices that they have made and the receptions to the game. And honestly, I'd say just the deluge of games, both AAA, AA, and indie overall. There's just so many to pick from at all times. You know, PC versus consoles is a war that's going to go on forever as well, just like subs v dubs. But because there is just so many titles that you can pick on any of those pieces of hardware, it's not like 25 years ago, where...
26.
No, Jack, no! It's bad enough when I round it to a good number. Oh. But you know what I mean. Like, you looked forward to the big releases much like a blockbuster movie, and now you're kind of like, there's some stuff in the cinema. The blockbusters are Marvels or Oppenheimer, and even that was a couple of years ago now, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, yeah. Barbie as well, don't forget Barbie.
Oh,
but
I love Barbie.
I've not actually watched it, but don't forget it. I forgot it, clearly. So, yeah, I think it's really interesting how... I mean, I'll jump on this point now, actually, that this game, I would say, certainly graphically, kind of framed the series a lot more, how it looked moving forward. It was probably more influential on the Final Fantasy series than Final Fantasy VII was. I think Final Fantasy VII was a more influential game on RPGs and gaming in general, but I would argue that Final Fantasy VIII, certainly the way it looked and the way that it was presented, with that whole let's push the graphics and make it look more realistic and like it is a film, that really I think was probably more influential on the Final Fantasy series than Final Fantasy VII was. I'll die on that hill.
No, you know what? I think I agree with you, because 7 was all very super deformed, very chibi models, unless you're in the battle screen or watching an FMV, but you know, that's not what you're looking at majority of the time unless you're grinding. Everything that came before was going to be 8 to 16-bit pixels, and therefore very super deformed just by virtue of that's what they had to make it in. And then 9 comes along and does a return to form of, oh, this is how it was in the old days, we're kind of harkening back to the cutesy models. And then after that, everything has been realistic graphics ever since. Or, well, realistic, stylized, yes, but realistically proportioned ever since. No, I think you're right on that one.
Yeah, but I think there was some kind of conflict at Square around what sort of path they wanted to go down, whether they wanted to be sort of hyper-deformed or they wanted to be more realistic. But I just think it's interesting that people have been screaming out, and obviously we're getting it now, of having a Final Fantasy VII remake that looks realistic. Now, obviously everyone loves the Final Fantasy VII original game, but people clearly want to see it look more realistic. Obviously, games were pushing to be more realistic, but because of that push from Square, probably more Katase than anyone, pushing Final Fantasy VIII as being more realistic, I think that it certainly started the ball rolling more quickly than it would have done. It's interesting to see what the landscape for Square and probably the landscape for graphics and stuff would have looked like without Final Fantasy VIII. I really think it's probably been more visually influential than 7 was. I just think that Square were always the trailblazers with graphics, to be honest with you. So I think maybe they pushed it maybe a year or so earlier than anyone else. You know, they weren't the only ones. We talked about Metal Gear Solid briefly there, was doing the same thing. I just think that it's clearly had more of an influence on the series than 7 has. I think 7's just had a more broad influence on games.
See, with FF7 and FF9 as well, I've never once considered the idea of, like, it doesn't work because of the way that the characters on screen look, right?
Yeah.
Like, FF7 works with the cutesy SD stuff, and FF9 similarly also works with the cutesy SD stuff, and I can't really imagine them being any other way. But FF8, with its more realistic proportions and the way that it's designed its everything, I can't imagine that in the same kind of chibi style.
No.
It just wouldn't work.
No, I probably imagine it in a more of an FS6 pixel art style. That would be really interesting to see, but I think you're right. I mean, the point I'm making is that clearly the games were going more realistic, and obviously a lot of games push for that. Final Fantasy X was that much more graphical. PS2 in general was just a lot more cinematic, and I remember people at times thinking, it's just like a film, even though it was nothing like a film.
Back in the day.
That was such a big thing, especially with arguments in the playground about which console was better. It was always the graphics are better, So like, clearly I don't think there's any argument that the graphics of the three classic Final Fantasies, that Final Fantasy VIII has the quote-unquote best graphics. It certainly has the most realistic graphics, and it certainly has the best interface with the cutscene stuff. It was probably the most dynamic graphically. Certainly the most like real humanity stuff.
Because overall, it doesn't really do too much different from those other two titles either. It's got those 2D backgrounds with a 3D model that's running over it. It's just that the models are proportioned differently. That's the only real difference.
The models don't really... I was thinking about this the other day. There's not really that many scenes where, in any of the other two games, with Final Fantasy VII or Fantasy IX, where they have much interaction, the models, with the actual CG cutscenes. It's quite uncommon. It happens occasionally.
I can think of a couple in FF7, and I remember being quite young, and even at the time being like, ooh, this doesn't look great, it's a bit jarring.
The only time I can think of in Final Fantasy IX where that happens, because a lot of the time with Final Fantasy IX, they just use there's the cutscene where they're going through the Gargant bit, where you can see the text boxes come up, and then you see the CG screen. But that's mostly just a CG cutscene with a couple of text boxes. And then there's a bit right at the end where Zidane goes into the Eiffel Tree with the CG cutscene that he's, running along as a character model. But I don't really remember that many other scenes where you're in the foreground, the scene in the back's moving. It's such a massive part of how Final Fantasy VIII is structured. There's the whole mission on the train, there's the whole bit with the gardens moving and everything like that, and apparently the second part of the second disc where there's the Battle of the Gardens was took up half the disc, and that bit where you're fighting the guy as the people are fighting in the background. That and itself was mind-blowing. It's something they kind of took a step back from in Final Fantasy IX.
Yeah, you're right, actually. Never thought about that.
I love all these games to death, so I'm not going to play the whole this one's better than that one. I just think it's really important to know that at the time, ignoring the story quirks and the people's problems with the battle system and stuff we'll get to in a little bit, it was well received for how it looked and how it was presented, most certainly.
Absolutely.
And something else to notice as well is that E3 was showing off, as I said before, that World of Heroes. It was showing off the CG cutscenes from Final Fantasy VI, which would have been a very different, perception for American and European audiences, because, of course, European audiences had never seen Final Fantasy VI before.
Yeah.
American audience would have been, wait a minute, wasn't this Final Fantasy III? And they would have been they're updating it. In a sense, it would have been like a quote-unquote remaster for the PS1 as opposed to the SNES, opening it up to another audience of gamers, but also open it up to Europeans, because at the time Europeans were like, what is this? Why is 6 coming out before? So it was a bit of a sort of transitional time. And of course, the main thing they were showing off in those cutscenes for Final Fantasy VI is the CG cutscenes they have for 6, which are not bad. They're okay. They're not as good as Final Fantasy VIII, but they're
serviceable. And I'm glad there weren't more of them. I'll put it that way.
Quote unquote better than the ones that were in Final Fantasy VII, but they're not as good as the Final Fantasy VIII ones. Clearly, there's less budget thrown at them.
Yeah.
If you look at the Final Fantasy VII cutscenes and then you look at the Final Fantasy VIII cutscenes, those Final Fantasy VI ones fit somewhere in the middle. It's almost like...
Yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me if they used... when they created the 6 cutscenes, they were almost like a prototype for what they use 8 potentially. I don't know.
I can see that. Piggybacking off of the models talk then, and the way that things look. Important question for you here, and this is going to make or break our friendship, Jack. I'm really sorry about this. What do you feel about the FF8 remaster?
Oh, it's fucking appalling.
Thank you. Oh, I knew there was a reason we were friends. It's bad, isn't it?
Sorry to get... right, just to sort of rewind a little bit on that, because I don't want to dunk on anything. I think with the lack of source code, I think they just did the best job they could.
Yes, agreed.
I will say that the models for the monsters and GFs look fantastic, but the character models can suck my balls, because especially Squall's character model, he's just such a twat now.
I think for me, they all look rather soulless. They look a little too perfect, and they don't quite fit the world anymore.
Right, okay, so we were just talking there about, you love your action figures, you love your figures and stuff like that.
My G.I. Joes and shit, yeah.
You love your G.I. Joes and your Barbies, right, yeah? And the Action Man, of course, he's the best one.
Oh, yeah.
You love your figures and stuff like that, and of course you talked about quality figures, and you talked about, differing figures, and sometimes these figures are of differing quality, but
absolutely,
their lack of quality can be a quirk.
Yeah.
Now, to me, if we're using the figures as a baseline, the original Final Fantasy VIII models felt like top-end, fantastic, new thing. They look realistic. Okay, so there are a few quirks when they load into the game, so at certain angles you can get some weirdness from them. The characters blink, which is fantastic if you remember in the original game. There are some angles where they look a bit
Goofy.
quirky and goofy because
Is
of
a
the
nice
age of
way
the
to say
game.
it.
I think a lot of that has to do with the compression because the models themselves on the PC version looked brilliant. Now, if you then look at the ones that are in the remaster, it reminds me like the figures you get out. If you go into like, if you ever went on holiday abroad and you got, when you have like, you put like a euro in like a machine and you open like, and you get like a gumball thing out and inside there's like a character. That's what they look like to me. You know what I mean? Where they're like made on the back of someone's van and they've like painted them a bit dodgily. That's what the models of Final Fantasy VIII Remaster look like to me. Squall in particular just annoys me.
Oh, you
how
really
he
don't
looks.
like that one, do you?
No, I really, really don't like it because it's just completely different. At least the other ones that they look somewhat like their original counterparts. I mean, Quistis looks a bit goofy.
I don't like Quistis's.
Renoa looks a bit goofy as well, but at least they look like they did originally. They just look a bit sharper. Whereas Squall just looks like a completely different character. His character originally, with his design, was very moody and very big coat, and it kind of like his hair was big, so it was like covering his face, and it was just a little bit more, and he was I think it was based off, was it River Phoenix or something like that, I believe. He was a good looking but like hidden away character, whereas the quirky 2019 version just looked like a generic emo kid.
See, I can't help but wonder if some of that direction for the remaster may have been influenced by Dissidia, actually, because
Probably.
Squall got, I don't want to say a significant remake, like he's very obviously still Squall in Dissidia, but it is tweaked enough that the remaster model looks more similar to the Dissidia version what I remember as Squall being.
And I think there's the real Squall somewhere between the Leon model they used for Kingdom Hearts and the Dissidia model they used for... It's just frustrating. The remaster itself was, again, I think they did the best with what they had.
Yes.
I mean, there's obviously a big discussion around which version of the mod on Steam looks the best and stuff like that, but I really struggle to play the remaster. I also get a bit annoyed at the remaster when you put the fast forward on and the music doesn't line up with the footage. Yeah, that annoys me. But anyway, that's just I really don't like what they did with the new character models. I think, to me, they should have spent the time on making the models look like the older ones.
See, I think for me, the biggest sin of the remaster relating to the models... I mean, the models are really kind of... I haven't played the remaster, so I don't really feel qualified to actually, speak about it, but it's because the models are that off-putting to me that I really don't want to.
No.
I'm sure it's perfectly serviceable as a game. If I'd heard that it was, unplayable, I'm sure I would have heard about it by now, But the backgrounds haven't been given the same treatment, so it's really jarring when I see footage of these really high-def models running around on a really shitty late 90s background.
I'll just jump on the remaster for me. It's interesting to talk about this now. So the three remasters obviously there's several remasters. The Pixel remasters, I can't praise enough.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there was a font issue originally, which you can mod in for the PC version, but the PS4 version has the text you can change because the original font looks awful in my opinion.
Yeah.
The font you can change it to looks much better. Now, I can't sing enough praises for the Pixel remasters, especially 6. It's probably the best way to play it in my opinion. Especially the soundtrack stuff. It's absolutely, I'll die on this hill, the best way to play Final Fantasy
All right,
III.
Jack, we get it. You have a boner for the Pixel remasters.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Well, and Final Fantasy III, God, if you're going to take the piss, at least take the piss properly, right? So, they look fabulous. Now, Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9 all had a quote-unquote remaster at certain points. Now, the Final Fantasy IX one, I think is a better way of playing it than the PS1 original.
Really?
Now, I just think obviously there's issues with the backgrounds. They're not as perfect or brilliant as they could be. I think it looks really, really good. There are a few moments where it's not perfect, but to me, I don't know, just because there's a lot more movement in Final Fantasy IX. There's a lot more backgrounds moving and steam coming out and stuff like that. It looks better when the frame rate's a bit better and it's a more HD. I think they did a better job of that one than they did the other two. Final Fantasy VII one, that looks fine. I haven't got an issue with that. It's just a bit sharper. The one problem with that version, certainly the one I played on PlayStation, is that sometimes the music doesn't play when you leave towns, and it's really off-putting if you go onto the world map and there's no music.
It for me.
Yeah, that sucks sometimes. I remember when I was playing, I had to go into Costa del Sol, left the world map, and the music didn't play. Now, I believe also as well, it will play the music from the last place it was played, so it doesn't do the thing where you go into the map, come back out, and then it starts the track again. It will just play it from where it last was. That sucks. So really, the only problem I've got with the FF7 remaster is there's the sound issue there. 9, I never really had the complaints with it. But then again, I'm not one of those people that gets really anal about frame rates and absolutely looking absolutely super duper amazing. As long as it looks good and it looks better than I remember, or at least as good as I remember, I am happy. I just don't think the FF8 one does, and I agree with you. It's difficult to play. It's a tricky one because if I were to play Final Fantasy VIII now, it's offsetting the speed that the remaster gives you against the experience playing it, I'd put up with the lack of speed because, go around the world map, you can put the speed up feature on it and go a lot quicker. I'd just put up with the fucking slow garden that takes forever to get across the sea, to be honest with you.
Yeah, 100%.
Rather than look at the dodgy models. Whereas with 9, I'd much rather have the speed up boost to be able to do Chocobo Hot and Cold a lot quicker to get through it quicker if I want to just enjoy the games casually, So, that's what I'd say about that. Interesting little tangent there.
Yeah.
But it's worth noting because we've never really spoken about the remasters before. We talked about it a little bit with Crisis Core last time, but yeah. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this game's place in the series. Okay. So what I mean by that is that we talked a little bit about, what the game looks like and the remaster in quite a big detail there. But it's interesting because this is a massive transition period for Square. And I've got like a little table here that looks at the differences between FF6 and FF8 and who the directors and the art directors and stuff like that were.
Between 6 and 8? Okay.
Between 6, 7 and 8. So the period between 6 and 8, I should say.
No.
So the way I understand it, a director is the person that's in charge of the creative vision. A producer is the person that gets shit done internally. Now, for Final Fantasy VI, we've got Yoshinori Kitase as director, Hironobu Sakaguchi as producer, Hiroyuki Ito as the designer, Ken Narita as programmer, and then multiple artists, but Nomura and Amano together. And then Kitase and Sakaguchi wrote it.
Right, okay.
Final Fantasy VII was Kitase as director, Sakaguchi as producer. It's not really clear who the designer was. It's sort of like quite a few of them, I think. Ken Narita was a programmer. Yusuke Naora and Tetsuya Nomura were the artists. And then Kitase and Kazushige Nojima wrote the game for 7. 8, it was Kitase directed it, but it was produced by Shinji Hashimoto.
Right, okay, so new producer.
Yeah, so that probably because at the time Sakaguchi was off doing the movie. Still designed by Ito and programmed by Ken Narita. The artists were Tetsuya Nomura and Yusuke Naora, like 7 was, and the writer was Nojima.
Interesting. I don't think I realised that Nojima wrote 8 scenario as well.
You can see this sort of transition period where the production can significantly change on Final Fantasy VIII, which I think had a bit of an impact. And of course, Final Fantasy IX was its own thing. It was the big change at the time at Square was that the Sakaguchi was going all Hollywood. So I've got FF6 and FF7 were both directed by Kitase and produced by Sakaguchi, whereas FF8 was directed by Kitase and produced by Hashimoto. So his credits up until now were Tobal 1 and 2.
Okay, can't say I've heard of that.
As Square as a producer, most notably, yeah. I've also got a note here that Mr. A to B himself, so Ito, was taken off FF8 partway through to help design FF9. Clearly, he just fancied a trip to Hawaii. I don't really know. Apparently, he built the GF and junction system.
Okay.
But drawing was added in by Nakazawa. So the drawing was a late addition to the game. So it probably explains why that system seems very convoluted, shall we say, the junction system. It seems to have been directed or created by too many cooks kind of thing,
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I still think it works, is the thing.
I think it works as well. Gets a bit of a rep as having a fraught development cycle. I mean, what Square game doesn't? Does seem a bit tame compared to Versus 13 and literally everything else after FF10, though, mind you.
Oh, you really wanted to get that one in there, didn't you?
I was trying to get a bigger dig in there. I'll jump on this now, and I will say that I think personally, and I don't know what you think about here, I think that Yoshinori Kitase is the best man to direct Final Fantasy games. Direct them.
Interesting.
Creatively. So I think it was really him that pushed the more realistic style, as we know, which I think Sakaguchi didn't like as much. And I've talked about how I think it's the most influential game compared to 7. Yeah, obviously spin-offs and stuff like that go for the more chibi style. Final Fantasy 14 is its kind of own thing, where it's in between in the middle. But I think that he's the best person in the director chair. It's up in the air whether or not Sakaguchi or whoever is the best person to be the producer and putting things together in the background.
Yeah.
I just think that the fact that Kitase directed 6, 7 and 8 just
that's a pretty volumes. Solid design lineup, to be fair.
They were all kind of his baby with a little bit of guidance from Sakaguchi and stuff like that. Now, you could argue that Sakaguchi was very, very little to do with 8, and it's the least of his original Final Fantasy vision.
Yeah.
And it probably explains why it's kind of like the dark horse in the series and feels a lot not as connected as some of the other stuff.
See, I've never really given that one too much thought, actually, because each of the different Final Fantasies have got their own really good creative vision, their own unique identity. I'm sure the names attached to it do mean something, but as a consumer, I'm not really too involved with the, individual names behind, I guess, beyond, the big ones that everyone knows. I do agree with you in that it does make sense why 8 stands out the way it does if it's development team wasn't exactly well, not exactly the same, but like it wasn't the same core members as it was before. And I'd never given that thought before. Thank you, Jack. You give me something new to think about every single month. I will say that I think the changing of the old guard, so to speak, works in its favour. I mean, obviously you and I both love 8, like, a ridiculous amount. We both consider it our favourite of the series combined. Like, we tie-broke this one, you know? And I think that probably changing around who was working on it had a lot to do with that. There's something to be said in getting new blood in to inject themselves into the piece of work that they're creating, you know?
I think as well, like that this was the transitional point in time for the graphics, like we were saying. The PS2 was on the horizon. They clearly, it was probably the right decision to start pushing stuff. But this game was very, very ambitious. They pushed a lot of stuff, and they pushed a lot of stuff that never really came back. So that, interacting with the background stuff was quite kind of like a quirk of the PS1. It never really became a thing again because everything was rendered in 3D following on from that. So yeah, I think that's something to be considered. I think as well that some of the quirks of this game and the way it's designed kind of felt like they maybe fall flat or haven't aged as well, but there was so much new that had happened in this. I mean, the card game, for example, was a big deal. Oh, yeah. The junction system, the draw system, the summons, the summons were so involved with the game. They're such a massive part of the game. I mean, they are in 7, but they're not really that big a deal in 7.
Not really, they don't matter to the plot, but then 8 made them matter to the plot. And then 9 made them matter to the plot, and then 10 did, and, 12 kind of walked it back again. But then 13 went and brought them back in again. 14 also did it. 15 also did it. 16 also did it.
16 definitely did, yeah.
So 8 definitely blazed a trail in that regard, I think.
I think that's absolutely right. I've never really thought about that before. I mean, I think the summons, they're kind of just tertiary in the games up until
you can make an argument for kind of 4 and 6, but it's not to the same degree.
6, you've got the Espers that are summoning monsters, but it's not really, it's more about the magic they give you than it is about the actual summon themselves. Yeah. But no, that's really interesting. It's like, and interesting how, and I'm going to mention him, Ben Starr's favourite Final Fantasy is Final Fantasy VIII, and then he went on to do Final Fantasy 16, which is so on board.
Knew you'd get it in at least once this episode.
Okay, so what we'll do then is we'll take a break, and we'll be back quite shortly to talk about more in-depth chat about Final Fantasy VIII.
Be good. I'm looking forward to that. See you in a bit.
Okay, so we're back after that short break. So I want to dig in a little bit into Final Fantasy. This is a bit more freeform because we talk about Final Fantasy VIII quite a lot. We both like Final Fantasy VIII. I've got some various headings about it, and I have some things that I've kept as aid memoirs, but most of this is in my head because this game is pretty much my entire personality. So just to frame it a little bit, obviously, we don't want to touch upon this too much because this really is a deep topic of dread. But there's obviously the kind of elephant in the room where Final Fantasy VIII has become kind of a dark horse of the series because of the internet and because of the fact that people didn't particularly like the junction system or because they're just wrong, really.
Don't soften the blow at all.
I just wanted to quickly touch upon stuff we've talked about at length before, where we've got a bit of a resurgence in Final Fantasy VIII fandom. Obviously, our good friend May, Game Dove, is very popular and pretty much mostly talks about Final Fantasy VIII. She also talks about Versus 13 and it's obviously
Kingdom Hearts as well.
Kingdom Hearts, and it clearly is a fan of other games in the series, but there's a lot of creators. Ben Starr's kind of led the charge for Final Fantasy VIII. He's talked about it in very, very public forums about Final Fantasy VIII is his favourite game. I believe that Neil Newbon talks about Final Fantasy VIII being a favourite of his as well. And of course...
Did he? I haven't caught that.
Yes, talked about how he really liked Sypha. I'm not calling him Cypher, he's Sypha.
Neil, if you're listening, we want you on.
Holly Bennett, who's the patron saint of this podcast at this point, has always gone about how Final Fantasy VIII is the best one, and that is an absolutely correct opinion, Holly. And Rob from PlayStation Access also unironically talked about how much he liked Final Fantasy VIII, which was, I think I mentioned before, was a big deal for me when I originally watched PlayStation Access, because I thought, oh, hang on, these guys they aren't going, I know what you think, but Final Fantasy VIII is good. They're just talking about how much they love Final Fantasy VIII, which I think is probably more, symptomatic is probably a horrible word, but it's more sort of like driven from the fact that I don't think that everyone had the same opinion of this game not being good.
Yeah.
I know that it was rated at like 10 out of 10 in various games publications in the UK at the time. I just think it's more to do with the internet and more the kind of meme of dunking on games. This was the easy game to dunk on because it probably didn't age as well as the other ones.
Which is just an insane take to me, because honestly, I suppose I can understand the concept of it not aging as well as other titles, but I think it's aged really well. It's a story about child soldiers and coming of age in a world that is torn by war and everything that goes hand in hand with that. I think, it's maybe not necessarily the most cognizant of its message sometimes, but that doesn't mean that it's any less good at delivering the message it delivers.
I think I've talked to before about, it's kind of the most teen of the series. I mean, they are, like you say, they are young adult fiction at their core. But Final Fantasy VIII kind of has that Catcher in the Rye coming of age vibe going for it, the whole inner monologue. And never talked about The Who on this podcast, but The Who made a piece of music called Quadrophenia, which was a coming of age story about a young man and had that internal monologue going through, which I think a lot of that stems from Catcher in the Rye as a piece of fiction. I'm not really that big a fan of Catcher in the Rye as an actual book, but I can see its massive influence. I think that a lot of the reason why people may have dunked on this game is because they're probably embarrassed because they relate to it. Because it almost like the story is a bunch of awkward teenagers, yeah?
Oh, yeah.
You get a lot of that in Final Fantasy anyway, but the story is almost told exclusively through a bunch of awkward teenagers, And the kind of villains and the other characters and the joke characters are all the adults, right? So it is very childish in a sense, whereas something like Final Fantasy IX, there's that kind of Steiner as the older character looking at the younger characters, and then they influence him, he influences them.
Right.
Freya as well, who's an older character than the sort of more teenage characters in the game. Final Fantasy VII, Barrett's older. They're obviously in their early 20s as well. You get a lot of that throughout the other games where, Final Fantasy XII, Varn and Penelo are younger, but Balthier is older and Ash is a little bit older, So there's this kind of young adult people all the way through from maybe early teens, tweens, to mid-20s, early 30s. There's this kind of, same in Final Fantasy 13, it's just, there's a wave of characters. Whereas Final Fantasy 8 is pretty much just a bunch of 17 and 18-year-olds, right? Not only are the 17 and 18-year-olds the main characters, they're also running the show in a lot of senses. Zhu is kind of like one of the de facto most important soldiers, and that's symptomatic of the world that a lot of the adults have been wiped out.
Yeah.
So there is this massive divide between the younger and older generations, and I think when we talked about it aging well, I think that the way the world is at the moment, with certainly in the UK, I can only really speak for the UK because it's where I live, there is a massive polarization generational. There always is, but there really is at the moment, especially with wealth. And I think that it resonates more because of that, personally. I think it's kind of time for its resurgence as a story, in a sense. And I think that's spoken by the fact that Expedition 33 has just come out, and Final Fantasy VIII is a massive influence on... Final Fantasy in general is, but Final Fantasy VIII pretty much is the main kind of story influence for Expedition 33. It certainly feels the most like that game tonally, where you have a young group of people that are a certain age. So I think the point I'm making is that I think a lot of people, probably me as well, probably were a bit embarrassed about relating to this game. I've always enjoyed the game at its core, the way the gameplay is, but when I've played it, maybe when I played it when I was sort of in my late teens, early 20s, I kind of played it again and thought, oh yeah, this bit's dumb. Oh, the romance is a bit, oh god, this sucks. Oh. But then as I got a bit older into my late 20s, I thought, you know what, this is actually, I'm not as embarrassed by this in my life now. And I think it's kind of like this, so it's kind of there's a dip period where people enjoy it, maybe. That would be my take. I don't know what you think of that, but...
I can only really speak for myself because I think I was the only person who knew that I'd played FF8 for a really, really long time, until I think relatively recently, all things considered. Yeah. But I've never been ashamed of liking it. I've definitely changed my opinion on some characters over the years. But yeah, I'm with you on the fact that they're all very relatable for very different reasons. I think that it's a very human cast. Maybe not necessarily a fully rounded cast, but I also don't think that it needs to be. And I think it's really interesting that you've related it back to, the wealth disparity, actually, and class disparity, because 8 isn't really the game that I would hold up as an example of class consciousness. I mean, far be it for anyone to use a video game as praxis anyway, but 8 isn't really the one that I would jump to being oh, this really displays X, Y, or Z. It has a story to tell, and it's a bit more of a fantastical story without so many grounding elements, because a lot of that realistic stuff is hidden, or it's slightly off the beaten track and you have to go looking for it. The realization that the house Laguna stays in Windhill, it's got bullet holes in, and that's where Alone's parents were probably slaughtered, and she probably watched that, and, by the way, they were kidnapping all these children from around the world to find a successor for the next world dictator. There's a lot of little things that are stated, but it kind of doesn't really hit you until after just how horrific some of this stuff is. And I don't think I'd ever really related it to real life in that regard, but I think the older that
interesting.
I've gotten and the more that I've clued into like real world politics and real world happenings, I don't necessarily see the actions and the things portrayed in 8 in the real world, but it has given me a new appreciation for the way that I engage with the story of 8.
See, I have. That's really interesting because and that might be because I've got a family, I come from a military family. So the stuff, the military-based stuff is something that kind of like resonates with me probably a little bit more than someone that hasn't come from that background. So the military side of something, I'm not in the military, but I've been adjacent to the military in some respects through career and through also family. So some of the sort of the military-based stuff with the seed stuff kind of resonated with me as a kid because of that background, but also I guess this doesn't really just apply to military stuff. I think it just applies to any job in general. Some of the stuff where the not so experienced people are put into positions of authority because they're the only people there to do it. Is like, like, oh my God, like there's no one else here. They've been wiped out, or they're just so dejected and they're not bothering to take part. It just so happens that the world falls to a bunch of teenagers to save it. That, in this game, more than any other game in the series, I think, feels a lot more... How do I put it? That the characters choose to take up that mantle, which I think is a bit of in kind of opposition to the fact that most of the characters in this game are part of the military, so therefore have been forced into this world where they kind of have to follow orders, right? A lot of the other characters in every other Final Fantasy game, they're all from various different backgrounds, and they kind of can become this like hodgepodge, unlikely allies type people. Pretty much almost universally, they are like that for the rest of the series, certainly before 8. Whereas within 8, there's this kind of like,
you're put together for a reason.
Put together for a reason, but then they go, fucking what? There's a cycle here that's created by this war and the endless setup that we don't like. So we're going to use that training and turn it on its head and break that cycle. And that is something that is, it's a bit clumsy at times how it's told. I think that was probably the vision they were pushing for. And I think that maybe the technology or the time or whatever wasn't quite there to tell that story. And as we've talked about before, I think some of that story came out, or some of the story beats or some of the story they were trying to tell came out later in Final Fantasy X with the relationship between Jecht and Tidus. So...
And again, we've made this point before of like 10 kind of being the follow-on from 8. Again, 10's cast is together for a reason. Maybe not necessarily the same kind of background or training, because they do kind of come from different walks of life, but for the most part, they're all in it together for a single reason. Yeah.
It's probably worth having a bit of a sort of... everyone knows Final Fantasy VIII at this point, but the broad story is essentially that, it's told from Squall, a bunch of teenagers' perspective, and essentially he's got to go and defeat the sorceress, and he finds out through various means that he needs to go and defeat the sorceress. And as you've discussed, the kind of inner framing devices, there's this cycle where, there's the sorceress on one side, there's the seed on the other one, and there's this kind of endless time loop of seed throughout the generations trying to beat the sorceress, and essentially this group finally breaks that cycle. There's not really a time loop in the traditional sense where Skull has to go back and change time. He goes back in, kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is probably more of an accurate way of describing the time stuff in this series, but the cycle is more from this is always going to happen unless we do something different, which is definitely something that comes up for Final Fantasy X. But I think the thing that, bearing in mind what you just said about scratching under the surface to see some of the themes in this game, which only becomes apparent if you really dig, is the relationship between Squall and his father, i.e. an older generation. Because, of course, the story here is about a bunch of orphans who obviously orphans don't have parents. So their older figures are upperclassmen who are maybe 1 or 2 years older. And then a bunch of really useless people that are in what's left, basically, of the people, middle-aged people, i.e. people in their 30s and 40s, which is horrible to think about at this point. So, like, the garden faculty, when there's a whole war, a garden between Norg and Cid, that's done by a bunch of people that have no idea how to take charge, that are in their 30s and 40s. And then a bunch of young people show them how it's done, which is where the coming of age, right, we have to do it this way. The segment in the second disc where, I think we talked about it in some of our list features, where Squall comes back to Garden to rescue it from missiles, it's the first time where he has had to think outside the box and has used his training to do something that he wants, which has been influenced by Renoa's influence as being more of a sort of freedom fighter type person. And that changes things, because that moment, it's sort of getting goosebumps thinking about it now, where they basically, in the nick of time, save Garden from the missiles, is like, everything changes now. Because this isn't part of the script. This wasn't supposed to happen. We weren't supposed to save this. And what I love about that in the game is that after that, you just get this, there's a little bit of friction, but like the music just starts again. It's Balam Garden theme. You're just floating in the sea. It's like, we had this massive thing that changed the world, but everything's just back to normal.
That's kind of a good allegory for coming out the other side of puberty and being considered an adult, actually. Like, this huge, devastating, life-changing thing has just happened that you had no way of stopping, but you survived it. And, now you're an adult. Now you get to take life on as you choose, apparently.
And the thing is with that, and what I love about, you kind of fill in the blanks a little bit with, I guess, my own experience. I've never saved a garden from a missile before. But what I mean is that Squall's character, he's kind of like in a sense, the unlikely hero. But he's also a lot more capable than he thinks. And what I mean, I'm struggling to find a way to phrase this, but what I think I mean is that Squall doesn't, and certainly the cast, don't think it's a big deal that they've saved Garden. That's certainly the way it's framed. It's just another day on the job, right?
Yeah.
But it's something that the older generation couldn't do.
Yeah.
It was something that Sid, at the time when I first played this, Sid's like, oh, you must do this, Squall, it's your destiny. And I remember thinking it was a bit cheesy because it was like, oh God, the adults, trying to get me to do what he expects of me. But actually, if you look at it now as a slightly older person, or a much older person, I should say, Sid hasn't got a fucking clue.
No.
And he needs to rely on Squall to do it because he knows that he can't do it and Squall's the only person capable. And that is like so much more, hits so much harder as being in my 30s now, thinking, oh my God, that is so accurate.
Agreed, actually. And this isn't really something that I've given an awful lot of thought to, but you bringing that up just now is kind of like, yeah, Sid failed. And we've talked at length before about how Sid is the real villain of Final Fantasy VIII.
Yep.
But like, in saying outwardly, like, you need to do this because I can't. I'm older and I know more and I technically have more power than you, but I have failed and this is now everything you have to do.
Yeah.
That's so genuinely tragic from an adult's perspective as well.
Yeah.
Again, being in my 30s, if I turn... and I'm not saying that Sid is in his 30s. He's like meant to be late 50s or something like that.
He's 40.
Oh, fuck off.
I know.
Okay, well, even so, that's still, like, in only 10 years, I'm sure I will change a lot. I'm sure you will. Everyone changes within a decade of their life, but, like, I can't imagine the change between 32 and 42 is going to be as drastic as, like, 17 and 27,
No.
If I turned around to a 16, 17-year-old and said, like, look, I couldn't do this really big, life-changing thing that doesn't just affect me, but it affects everyone that I'm taking care of, and I'm kind of washing my hands of it, and it's now your problem. I would genuinely expect every single person that I know to take me to fucking task. And the fact that Sid gets away with that is genuinely sickening to me as an adult now.
I do agree with that, and I reckon there's definitely a subject line. We've talked about this a few times. We flirted with the idea that Sid is the real villain of Final Fantasy VIII.
I hate him. I hate him. The fact that they've hidden him behind Robin Williams' fucking friendly visage is the ultimate misdirection, because I dislike that man.
Now,
Not
how
Robin
he's
Williams,
got a deer, how he got a deer as well is just beyond belief.
Oh, yeah.
But let's go down this path a bit more. I think the broader point I'm making, and this is it makes me smile actually thinking about this. It's quite emotional because the problems Squall has, the challenges he has are just social problems, right?
Yeah.
He's a very, very capable soldier. He's a very, very capable tactician, and he's a natural leader, right? And that's driven from his experience, which is, a lot more focused for someone of his age than in normal circumstances. So he doesn't succeed in spite of his circumstances. He exceeds because of his circumstances. So basically, Sid, if you look at the way the game's, the kind of inference of the way the game's set up, is the older generation, the people in their 40s, right? I think the idea is that the Sorceress War happened between... So Sid probably had a relatively normal childhood, and people of his age group had a relatively normal childhood. Yeah. It was people from his age down pretty much don't exist. Yeah. They're all gone because they've all been wiped out in a war, right? So you've got a generational gap. So he's coming from his experience of like relative prosperity and it's probably been okay. Mm-hmm. He can't relate to this guy that's been in the war-torn environment that hasn't had parents and stuff like that. So basically, there's a movie called The Grey Man starring Ryan Gosling where he uses a phrase, this is just another Thursday, which I love, which is basically like, this is really stressful to me, but I've been brought up in this environment, so it's just another Thursday, i.e. these kids have grown up with war. It's so normal to them that me saving the garden's no big deal, but my fucking God, I can't speak to that woman. But when you play that as just after you've left that, you think that's really childish and silly, but actually looking at it, it's like, oh my God, like actually like humanity and war and things like that. There's a movie with Kurt Russell in it in the 90s called Soldier, and I believe that it's a big influence on Halo.
Okay.
So I don't know that for certain, but essentially, like, the idea is that they're bred to be super soldiers and they're taken away and they never have any, like, human interaction, and they are essentially these superhuman people they're put on a planet. And then the villain comes in, played brilliantly by Jason Isaacs, comes in with these genetically altered superhuman soldiers, and the phrase is, your men are obsolete, right? So it's a daft, quirky 90s movie, but essentially the theme of it is that you can't trump experience. And I mean, that's a bit of an aside, but the point is that this character is this killing machine. I mean, Kurt Russell's absolutely jacked in the movie, and he is a ruthless killer, and he's basically defending this camp from all these monsters coming in, and he can do all this stuff, like he can like smash these snakes, beat everyone, and he's just a one-man army, right? And then a woman comes up to him and like gets in his space and flirts with him, and he has no idea what to do because he's never experienced it. But the point is that like, what's hard in your life is the stuff you haven't done yet, you know?
Yeah.
And I love how, like, at the time when I was a kid thinking, oh my God, all the superhuman, like, let's save the world stuff is seen as, like, no big deal, man. But talking to a girl's really, really hard. That seems really childish when you're that age and maybe a bit older. But now looking back, it's actually like, well, it's actually more, like you say, tragic, because they're so used to war. Oh, I'll just pick up a rocket launcher and kill that person. Yeah. All the other stuff that they should have been able to have under a nice controlled environment and should have been able to have a family together and everything like that is exceptional to them. You know, it's tragic, but it's also quite moving in a sense that they're the kind of ripped off generation that have to show everyone how it's done, you know?
See, it's interesting because while you were saying all that, I thought of Final Fantasy VIII actually backs you up in saying that. There's a point where Squall, watching Laguna fail to talk to Julia, is like, this is pathetic. I can't watch this anymore. And I can't imagine that Laguna would have been too much older than Squall in that sequence. I think he's meant to be like 21,
27.
22. Oh, right, okay, so he's got 10 years on.
Well, it's difficult to know because that's what it says in the guidebook, and I don't know what point in Laguna's life he's supposed to be 27. I don't know what dream sequence it is. So he's early 20s or mid-20s, you know? Okay. Not much older.
But even so, for Squall to watch that and recognise, like, this is painful, and then to unconsciously repeat that in his own life, you know, maybe not at the same age, but in a similar kind of situation, because we do later see Laguna maybe not being, like, technically apt at his situation, but he's not afraid of going into Estar and fighting soldiers. He's not afraid of lobbing his friends and then himself off of a cliff. He's not afraid of storming a building where a child that he was taking care of is being kept, and then accidentally falling into presidency because he didn't like the way that the country was being run, and other people were like, "Oh, you're a good man for the job."
It's like an afterthought. I'll just do that. It's all right. Yeah.
But he had an issue speaking to Julia. He has issues communicating with Rain. Like, that's fascinating, and I'd never considered that before. God, this game is so fucking good.
It is fucking good. Now, what I also like about Final Fantasy VIII, I mean, there's so much I like about Final Fantasy VIII. So there is that storytelling, and I do really believe it's clunky. In a sense, it's unfinished. And I think in a way, like I've said before, it was done better in Final Fantasy X. So essentially, I'm talking about the generational, the fathering through memory, as opposed to the fathering through being there. So obviously in Final Fantasy X, Jecht disappears into Spira, and he's an absentee father. Tidus has a really crap relationship with him, and he is a bit of a knob. But then as Tidus is going through Jecht's journey, he sees, oh my God, this guy's gone through the same shit I have. And he wasn't so bad, actually. I'm not saying any stretch of the imagination Jecht's a good person, but a lot of the challenges he has, Tidus had himself, and he almost becomes close to his father and can understand his father a lot more, not through interacting with him, but by seeing how he interacted, and by him turning around to Auron, for example, and saying, look after my kid, and I really do love him, I just can't express it, which doesn't completely absolve Jecht from his shitty parenthood.
No, not at all.
But at the same time, it humanises him, and it allows them to be able to sort of understand each other a bit better, I should say. Now, in Final Fantasy VIII, I'm gonna completely contradict myself and talk about how much I think it's done well in Final Fantasy VIII. I think, like I said, I do think that part of the story is done better in 10. It's sort of a lot more thought out in 10 and structured into the story. In Final Fantasy VIII, pretty much the idea is that Alone is trying to send Squall back in time to, I think, stop Laguna from going off to war, so that
she wants just to have a big happy family again.
Laguna, Rain, Squall, and Alone can be one big happy family. That's pretty much the gist of it. Now, what I think is absolutely brilliant, and this is where time travel is absolutely, this kind of paradoxical, the Matrix, the Oracle turn around saying, don't worry about knocking over the vase, but if I hadn't have told you about it, it wouldn't have happened. That sort of flipping paradoxical thing is that the whole, if Alone hadn't been there sending Squall back into the past to meet Laguna, his path would have been completely different.
Yeah.
So he has that similar path of you see how this person who, by the way, is your father officially, it's never stated in the game, you've learned from his experiences and you've actually seen that in some ways you're a lot like him. He's more outwardly projecting what he's actually like. You're internalizing, you're actually very dorky, similar people. And
sorry, Squall.
There's a line when they meet where Squall turns around and says, you were a bit of a buffoon. Or something, I don't know what the actual phrasing is, but he pretty much dresses him down and says, you're a bit of a dick, but my God, I like how loyal you were to your friends.
Yeah.
Something like that. Now, what I think is probably the most understated piece in Final Fantasy VIII's history is, Final Fantasy VIII, when people are talking about it, is that both Squall and Laguna succeed in rescuing Alone. Both of them do it.
Yeah.
So right at the end of Laguna's dreams, I have a problem with Laguna Dream Sigma because there's no big boss you fight at the end, but pretty much the final dream, right at the end, you've been all the way through the dream sequences. It's been about protecting Alone and getting hold of her. And right at the end, you get into the cell and she's rescued. She runs to him, and that's the end. And he's done it. He's succeeded in his mission of rescuing Alone at all costs. And then at the end of, I think it's the beginning of Disc 4, or maybe it's the end of Disc 3, where Squall goes to fight Seifer.
Yes.
And he rescues Alone from Seifer. He turns around and goes, go and wait outside. Laguna's waiting outside. And that's brilliant for two reasons. One, he's succeeded in the same path and he's rescued Alone on his own, but he trusts Laguna with her because he's got to know him. So regardless of whether he likes him, regardless of whether he has this prepared relationship, he knows him enough to trust him.
Yeah.
And that's understated in the narrative because essentially both of them succeed in the same thing, but I think essentially Squall wouldn't have been able to do that without Alone sending him back and teaching him where Laguna went wrong and where he went right. And I think that's probably something that's not spoken about that much with Final Fantasy VIII. It's like that scene at the end of Laguna is the end of Laguna's dream sequence where he rescues Alone. It's fantastic. The scene with Squall later on is kind of very throwaway, like just go outside, I'm going to deal with this prick now about Seifer. And I think that ties in with what I was saying there, where it's just so easy for him. I've rescued you now. Fuck it. It's not a big deal. Fucking brilliant.
Off the back of that then, and also going back to something that we were talking about earlier, the characters are all very human, very relatable. Who did you relate to most as a child, and who do you relate to most now? Is it the same person, or has it changed?
Oh.
Caught you out with that one, haven't I?
That is a very, very good question. I always liked Squall, and I always related to Squall, because I saw myself as a bit thinking in my head a lot. As I've grown up, I kind of associate myself more with Laguna. But it's tricky. It's a bit of a cop-out, but we've just said they're kind of a very similar character. They just present themselves differently. So I'd say yes and no. I think it was Squall as a youngster, and then it became Laguna. Because I think I'm more of I'm certainly not a Squall. I'm not an interested person. I'm very much a social person. But you know what I mean? I would say that as a kid, Squall. As I got a bit older and played it a bit more, Laguna. Not that very many else I really directly relate to. They all seem like peripheral characters to me. They're not people that I directly relate to, if that makes sense. I don't see myself in any of them really. Maybe a little bit of Irvine with the sort of nervousness piece at times, and maybe a few sort of general character quirks that are shared between the cast. But I think the problem with Final Fantasy VIII's cast, maybe just to sort of go off on a tangent a little bit from what you just asked me, that in a sense, in some ways, they're a bit of a homogenous blob. I think some of it comes down to the fact that not all of them have character themes, like say Nobuo Uematsu deliberately did it so he didn't have character themes for each character. Whereas Final Fantasy VII has Cid's theme, and when a Cid's on the screen, Cid's theme's playing. And it has Barrett's theme, and when Barrett's on the screen, Barrett's theme's playing. Tifa, Cloud. Again,
you nearly
Final
called
Fantasy
him Squall
IX.
there, I heard it.
I nearly called him Cloud. Right. Final Fantasy IX has character themes for all the characters. Final Fantasy XIII has character themes for all the characters. They're all individual characters, and so a lot of their lines are just going to be said by those characters. In Final Fantasy VIII, a lot of the extra bits you get from the individual characters, you may never have seen because you have to have that character in the party, and they get a little bit of a weird, quirky thing. There's a scene in the Balam Town Rescue where if you have Quistis in the party with Zell, you have to have Zell and Squall in the party, but if you have Quistis in the party, she tells a story about how Zell accidentally went into the girl's bathroom.
Oh yeah, on his T-board, right?
On his T-board, and then she's like, stop it. And then if you have Irvine in the party, Irvine shoots the gun on the wall. So a lot of those character moments about the specific characters, like, you don't have to see in the game.
Yeah.
Which kind of makes it a bit of a disservice. I think that Final Fantasy VIII would have benefited from what they used in 9, which is the ATE sequence, where you could see what all the other characters were doing. But I think they kind of feel like you are Squall, you are Laguna, and everyone else is on the periphery. And I think that's what they were going for. I don't think it's necessarily a fault or a problem. That's my take on it. Be interesting to see what you think.
I feel like I wouldn't say no to ATEs in 8, because I would love to see more of 8. Like, there's no getting away from that one. But at the same point, by virtue of the fact that you can hear, in quotes, Squall's inner thoughts, and you don't hear that from anyone else except for Laguna, but only in the dream sequences, never when Laguna's just on the periphery in Disc 3 in Estar. I don't think we're meant to, like, sure, you can want to know more about those characters, you can want to know more about the world, but I think it's very, how do I phrase this? I like that we only have a limited view at the world, and I like that everyone has their own interactions with the world, and you only get to see them if you bring them along to certain situations. And granted, that doesn't actually happen all that often, but it offers a really nice view into those characters as individuals as well. I think the best example I can think of is when you go to the deep sea research facility, and if you bring Zell with you, he asks like, oh, do you know anything about this? And you can tell him like, no, tell me. And Zell has a really good textbook monologue about what the deep sea research facility is, what it was notable for doing, blah blah blah. And I think Squall in his inner monologue says, maybe I shouldn't underestimate this guy, actually.
He does,
and it's like, fuck!
There's more to this guy. Yeah.
Like, Squall and, by extension, the player, your relationships with these characters are developed by how much time you spend with them and how you see them react and interact with the world, just like in real life. And that's what I really, really love about 8. Because, like, you know, if I'm hanging out with friend A and we go to a store together and we see something cute and we're like, oh, that's cute, whatever. And, you know, my friend is like, I don't really like that. But if I took friend B and friend B was like, oh, I have one of these at home and I can tell you all about, that's a completely different experience. And I would never know what friend A or friend B would said about it if I took the other one, you know? Like, I don't know. Maybe it's not the best storytelling. Maybe it's not the most robust storytelling. And I do think that the ATE system has some merits to it. But I also don't think it's the be-all, end-all of it.
Yeah, I think as well. I mean, this ties in a little bit with what I was saying before about this game tried a lot of things and was prototypical or didn't quite stick the landing with all of them, because what you're describing there is how Persona is, right? You know, you can like choose who the best girl is or the best boy is or whatever like that. It's all about who you choose to like and stuff like that, and who you choose to involve in your kind of favourite story and character and stuff like that. And that's sort of something that's become more apparent in games through games like Persona and other things like it. Final Fantasy VIII was clearly a long time before Persona.
I don't know about that.
Well, a long time in gaming terms. I mean, like, it's about 5 or 6 years. It's a long time. You know what I mean? Like, is it? Well, maybe it's not.
I'm gonna look that up now. Hang on.
Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I'm thinking of like Persona 3 was the first. I mean, I'm not that clued up on Persona. I think Persona 4 is the one that's the one that your relationships with people is key. I'm not really a massive guy on Persona early on. I certainly think that Persona 4 was the first time where it became internationally...
Okay, Persona 4 came out in 2008, Persona 3 was 2006, and then previously Persona 2 seems to have 2 releases, one in 99 and one in 2000, and then Revelations Persona, which is on the release timeline on Wikipedia as the first one released, was in 96. Right,
so I think that like the 3D ones, certainly 3 and 4 were where it became international. So, I mean, perhaps the Persona was doing these things around the time Final Fantasy VIII was. I don't think it was doing it as well or as well known until later. I think the point I'm making is that was something that was prototypical at the time, and it was something that they punted for. And maybe if people are thinking, just imagining Final Fantasy VIII being like a Persona game now. Oh my god, that's Type 0. Let's not talk about Type 0. Where essentially you can choose to interact with all the different characters in different ways, which I mean, but at the same time, it's kind of like this weird contradiction, isn't it? Because it has that everyone's their unique character, but in some ways they feel like they're part of a homogenous blob, because you can't do what you do in Persona, where you get to know them a bit more. You can, like, if you choose to take a different person somewhere else, and you can interact with, like, to a certain extent, but at the same time, you still only see these characters from Squall's limited perspective and his limited understanding, you know?
I think Squall being the player character and, you know, we get to see his inner thoughts and stuff, it's Squall's journey and it's Squall's story. So the others... This doesn't sound like a very nice term, but the other characters orbit him.
Yeah.
And they are part of his story, but they are not necessarily his story. You know, his stresses about the world and becoming, leader of Garden and the freer of the world, essentially, has nothing to do with Zell dating the girl in the library. It has nothing to do with Quistis's errant crush on him that turned out to maybe not be a crush, but maybe she was hiding it. We don't know.
Cop out.
It has nothing to do with Irvine overcoming his anxiety. All of those things are good character points, and I think if those characters had those motivations further realized and further fleshed out, I would have absolutely nothing bad to say about the cast whatsoever. But as it stands, yeah, I agree with you. But I can also kind of understand it. I don't know, it feels like I'm arguing 2 points of the same position.
This is what this game does to you. I think maybe I'll jump in and say, and I don't want to speak for you, but I think that Squall really, maybe other than Renoa, Squall really is the only character in this game that could be the lead.
Yeah.
Because he's the only all-rounded character. Renoa is so when we spoke about Final Fantasy IX, how essentially certainly Dagger, Zidane, and Vivi could all be considered the lead character, and they're kind of you take the reins of those characters at various points in the game. Dagger, almost half, maybe not half the game, but a good chunk of the main narrative you are playing as her. I know that you play as Zell when Squall goes off into space, but there's no real Zell doesn't have any individual scenes where you discover something as Zell. And Zell, you don't get the inner monologue with Zell when you're playing as him. You're just using him as a character. And I think it's also interesting that in this game, and I think a lot of it was just a flex on what they could do with the technology, but the fact is that the characters follow you around in this game.
I loved that. I was so sad when they got rid of that again in 9.
But it ties into that thing of more often than not, Squall is at the front of the pack.
Yes.
Kind of thing. And it's the people that are following him. So it ties in what you were saying about he's the lead character. So I guess you've probably already answered it, but I'm assuming that the Squall was the person you related to as well. Or did you have someone that you may have related to a bit more in this game?
See, that's an interesting one, because I don't think as a child I actively would have been able to point out who I related to. There were definitely characters that I wanted to be friends with or be more like. I wanted to be a Renoa. I wanted to be like Selphie. Selphie had fucking hella friends, and I had none as a kid, And the characters that I think as a child that I actually did relate to, I didn't like. And looking at it with adult eyes now, I think it's because I did relate to them a little too hard. Irvine's overconfidence tries to mask his anxiety, but it comes off as awkwardness and it alienates the people that he's trying to get to know. Zell's overexuberance isn't well received by people that aren't necessarily on his wavelength, and he's an awkward person in the bunch. Squall has such deeply internalized issues, there's no better way to put it. He has such bad anxiety and is forced to mature so much quicker than he ought to have. And these all take a real big toll on these characters. As an adult, I would like to say that I don't relate to any of them. I probably do in certain aspects, but I think I'm comfortable in saying that I've become well-rounded enough and matured enough as an individual and healed enough from just the trauma of childhood and puberty, because that's traumatic no matter who you are in the world, let's be fucking real here, that none of them relate to me personally. But I still kind of wish I was a Selphie a little bit,
Yeah, I'm going to sort of correct myself as well, because that's interesting you said that. I reckon, just to add to the who could be a lead character, I think Selphie could probably do it as well. I think maybe there's a bit of a flex to say Selphie could have been a lead character of this game. I don't think there's enough.
I think she could have had moments.
I think the reason that maybe not quite is because there's quite a lot of what I would say is missing content from Trebia.
Yeah.
Because I believe there was supposed to be more going on in Trebia. If you'd had a more of a segment where it would have been a bit of a diversion into Selphie's past, then maybe. I think maybe. I mean, it's difficult to say because it's in the past now. But
they lost the source code, so they ain't going back.
Yeah. So I think the point I'm making really is that none of these characters, other than Squall and Renoa, none of the main core teenage characters, other than maybe Sifa as well, have an arc, right? In fact, Sifa doesn't really have an arc. His story doesn't end. Quistis' story doesn't end. Zell's story doesn't end. At the end of the game, Zell's just as awkward as he was at the beginning. All that really changed for these characters, other than Squall and Renoa, is that they trust each other more as friends. They become more friends with each other. They learn that they have shared history together. There's not Zell doesn't become less awkward. He's still a doofus at the end of the game.
Yeah.
Irvine's still a doofus at the end of the game. Quistis is still a bit lonely and hasn't got someone at the end of the game. Selphie's exactly so. Whereas Squall is a complete, recluse and then
that's
smiles at the end of the
and
game.
This is kind of more of a general literary question than a specific FF8 thing. Then, do you think that's a bad thing?
No, I don't, because it's Squall's story.
I agree with you. It's interesting because actually just last night at time of recording, I was having a debate with someone about the characters in Final Fantasy XIV and their role in the latest expansion, Dawn Trail, and how some of the characters that we feel like aren't necessarily necessary in the role in the story because their character arcs have been previously concluded and they haven't offered anything to the story, they haven't been offered any opportunities for growth, they're just there. They are pieces of dialogue wearing the face of characters that we've come to know and love, you know? And that is, I think, a really big disservice to the world and the characters of Final Fantasy XIV. And I kind of feel like a bit of a hypocrite for turning around and being like, but FF8 didn't really have character arcs at all, and I think that's fine. But I agree with you. I think it's absolutely fine. Well, yeah, the story's different, but... I
mean, yeah, I think... Does Rinoa have a character arc?
I'd say so.
Not really. Maybe a bit more, but certainly not as much as Squall. I mean, Squall's character arc is that he starts off as a recluse, doesn't trust anyone, begins to trust himself.
I think I've made this argument before. I think it was when we had Mayon, maybe the first time. Squall and Rinoa's character arcs are kind of... They're not an exact inverse of each other, but Squall learns to trust his friends and lighten up a little bit more and ironically become more of an adult by letting himself be more childish, in a sense. Whereas Rinoa starts off as very, very childish and matures exponentially after she meets Squall and has a few life-changing moments. I think that their paths cross, but don't necessarily mirror.
I think what the point I'm making is that I think Rinoa, maybe it's because I'm focused more on like the fact that Rinoa is essentially the same person at the end of the game. She's still just as chilled out. I think you're probably right. I do agree. And I think that Rinoa is essential to this game. But I also would say, which is really interesting, is that if you remove any of the characters from this game, it wouldn't work.
No.
Like, whereas if you remove Amarant from Final Fantasy IX, I don't think it matters.
Couldn't go an episode without bringing him up, huh?
Yeah, and then you've got like Final Fantasy VII that has Vincent, Valentine, and Yuffie that literally you don't need to have in the story. So the game does work without them.
Yeah.
I'm not taking away from those characters because they're great characters, but you see what I mean? Like, I mean, Amarant isn't a great character, but like the point is that like if you remove Zell, you lose that, you know, his kind of archetype, the archetype of like teen, because you get the archetypes of teenage life through this. You get the Selphie's the exchange student, Quistis is the slightly older sort of...
She's the older sister type.
The older sister character, Zell, is the awkward person, but he's also the only one with the parents.
Yeah.
You know, and Irvine is the kid from another place that
hasn't fit in at all.
Doesn't fit in at all, and all of them have really important quotes that you can focus on them as a character. That's who they are. That's their archetype. You know, so I think they're all important. I think they're all great. By the way, there's no character.
No.
They're all fabulous characters.
I think if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have disagreed with you and I would have said that Zell and Irvine were not important to the story at all. And as an adult, I kind of want to smack the me of like 20 years ago and be like, you are fucking wrong. What are you on about?
The only playable character that's probably the least important playable character is Ward. But I think Ward and Kairos kind of like... They are a bit homogenous. They're kind of just like Laguna's sidekicks.
See, very similar to... who did we say this about? You're going to laugh about this comparison. Very similar to Crisis Core. Listeners, the face Jack just made at me on camera cannot be described. No, genuinely, I think they're very similar to Crisis Core in that if Laguna is Sephiroth... Ward and Kairos are his Angeal and Genesis.
Why would you do this, Mole?
You might not like the comparison, but they are needed to round him out as his own personality. They are needed for him to bounce off of, and you really hate that, don't you? Because you know I'm right.
No,
I'm right.
But no, that's not why I hate it. I do know you're right, but I'm just imagining Crisis Core with Laguna and the... Like, I mean, Laguna...
Oh, that would make Crisis Core 55,000 times better. What do you want about?
Maybe it would. I don't know. I mean, I love Laguna.
Nothing about Crisis Core changes except Laguna's just, like, lost in the background.
I love Laguna. I don't think he's as cool as Sephiroth. They both have glorious hair, don't they? Let's be honest.
Who's your bigger man crush? Sephiroth or Laguna?
Laguna in the original game. Sephiroth in like, the remake project. Because he's just so... Yeah. I'm just gonna say he's just so big, and like he's just like they make this point of pointing out how much like larger Sephiroth is than everyone else. He's kind of got that Darth Vader vibe going on, of like he towers everyone. You know,
sounds to me like you just want Sephiroth to be the big spoon.
I want all 17 inches of Sephiroth, which is a reference to a figure. Yeah, I'm talking about figures more. What are you on about? Like you get a 17-inch figure of Sephiroth because of Rebirth.
I quit this podcast.
What are you thinking of? Like, anyway, just to sort of frame out a minute. All right, I think that rounds out our deep thoughts on Final Fantasy VIII. I mean, we could have about a massive 15 million part series on this game, couldn't we? But I think that's probably touched upon the stuff we've flirted with on the podcast, but not dug into.
I'm glad we didn't do this for episode 1. I don't think we could have gone this in depth.
No, I totally agree. We're better at this now. Yeah. We will definitely talk about Final Fantasy VIII again from the story perspective. There's a lot more to talk about, but I think it's a good time to maybe talk about the gameplay a little bit, because we've talked about the junction system, about how it's a bit not as well liked. What did you think about the junction system then? Just to dig into that a little bit.
As a child playing it for the first time, I got it. I didn't have any trouble with it at all. I think maybe the only things that I didn't really connect with was like junctioning status attacks, because I don't really do that in video games.
Who does that?
I'm not a status attack person. I'm a HP goes fucking down person. Strength goes up, HP goes down, and not status attacks. We don't care about those, which means I really struggle when it comes to games like FF13, and it makes me do that. I don't know. I didn't mind it, and I still don't mind it. I can see that it's kind of clunky, and I can see that it is kind of broken.
You can break it, yeah.
But I also don't care.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's one of those things, like people say that of the phrase that your favourite Final Fantasy is usually the first you play, and I think this is my favourite, it's the first I played. The point I'll make is that the junction system gives you a lot to do. So if you play this as a kid, when you have the whole summer to play, when it's a beautiful day outside, to sit and play and
sit inside and bleach your skin with the CRT, that's the spirit.
Sit for half an hour drawing cure spells or learning how many wizard stones you need to produce Blizzaga spells. I think it's really cool because it's like, I know you've talked in the past about how you don't like grinding, but like to me, like you can see in this game really easily where you need to, like the next jump up from what you have.
Yeah.
So where Final Fantasy XIII fails, in which I don't know what a lovely flipping fang does, because I've no idea whether that's better for my weapon than that other fang I've got over there. What the bloody hell's that about? I don't bloody know. This game literally goes, right, oh, this stone here will turn into 5 flares or 5. Yeah. You're like, what's that magic? Oh, I'm going to check what that is. I can try it out. There's a massive toolbox for you to play with, and it lets you discover it, and it frames it, and it explains what they all do far better than, say, Final Fantasy XIII does. And it gives you like an open ticket to look at the entire game from the beginning, which enables you to sort of tailor your own experience through the game.
Yes.
Which I like. Tactics is actually, in a weird way, very, very similar. It's a different setup, but Tactics gives you a massive game, and it's a bit of a learning curve. What the fuck do I do to get through this? Final Fantasy VIII is kind of different than Tactics. Tactics, if you start and you don't know what you're doing, you will get to Dorma and die and never play again.
Yeah.
Or come back in 2 years and play again. That's what will happen, and eventually you'll get to the point where you will understand your way to play through the game, and you'll be challenged very, very well. But you can break it the same way. You can sit there and you can like get a Dark Knight in 50 hours or whatever.
Oh yeah, trust me, I watched my best friend play through Tactics, and their method of grinding was, I'm going to slap my friend silly around the face, and the last mob on the battlefield is just going to have to watch this fucking happen.
Yeah, it's pretty much just, you do the Dragon Ball Z thing of power up, and then you earn some JP. That's what happens with that game. But the thing is with Final Fantasy VIII is it's deceptive, it tricks you, because it's the same, but you can get pretty far by winging it in Final Fantasy VIII. And a lot of people have a similar experience. Like, I had the experience, I got to the Ragnarok, and I was like, I haven't junction magic. I've no idea what the bloody hell it's for. I've just been spamming GFs, and it's worked up until now. And now I've no idea how to get through it, because I don't understand how to junction magic. And then my friend told me, you can now junction magic to your attack. And I go, really, can you? Because I haven't bothered listening to the tutorials. Because my other friend told me I don't need to read them, right? You know, it's a lot to take in and learn, but you can kind of ignore that stuff and just crack on a little bit and get on with it.
I will say, I think 8's biggest sin when it comes to the gameplay and the battle system is that a lot of the systems are made redundant by endgame. Like, if you have set up your junctions properly, you're not going to want to use any of that magic, because that's then going to take away from your stats, and some of the GFs are A, not going to be as powerful as they were when you first got them, or B, take too fucking long. I'm looking at you, Eden. Why does that take fucking... Go make dinner while that thing's playing, for Christ's sake. Like, it kind of becomes...
Run around the block.
Yeah, it becomes a little bit more feasible to then just spam attacks, or to use, like, maybe 1 or 2 pieces of magic in order to proc something else. So I'm thinking of, like, aura for limit breaks, or potentially items, but I don't even think I really used items all that much. So it's good up until a certain point, and then it needs something else for endgame, I think, but I couldn't tell you how to fix it.
it's a little bit annoying that the magic that you'd use in battle is pretty much just, for me, it's aura, meltdown, and maybe demi.
Yeah.
But the thing
Not
is that's
Ultima.
annoying about that is, well, no, but the problem is that Ultima has one spell, which is do 9999, and you can, like, basically, if you get to the point where your junctions are good, you can do that with an attack anyway.
Yeah, it's true.
So, but the point is, if you spam meltdown and then basically vit zero the enemy, you can just kill him and break the game.
Yeah.
But the point is that, like, once you know how to play this game, the game's quite easy. I love it. I can't really sing its praises enough. I think meltdown as a concept is just fantastic, of like vitality zero in the enemy. And I think that really there's not that many challenging bosses in this game which know what you're doing because of the nature of the system. I think Omega Weapon is the only one that's really hard. Now, I mean, Ultimate Weapon is hard as, like, technically, if you want to, like, solo Ultimate Weapon, it's a nightmare because it can KO you with a light.
No, I'm not that stupid, but thank you for the offer.
Yeah, but Omega Weapon, like, you can. It's a pattern.
Oh, you've talked about that before, yeah.
Diablos is a pattern. The rest of the bosses in Ultimacia Castle, like, with fully junction parties, you can kind of, like, go through and beat them. And of course, in Ultimacia Castle, you can, you're locked out with certain abilities, but you can kind of pretty much, other than maybe the first boss, you can do them in any order.
Yeah.
So you can tailor your own experience even there. So initially you think, oh my god, this is, like, handicapping me by taking my abilities off me in the final dungeon, Ultimacia Castle. But actually, the fact that it gives me the option to do whatever I want kind of takes away from that challenge. So I don't think that the game itself is really, once you know what you're doing, you can break it really easily and enjoy it. But that might just be because I've played it so much and I know it like the back of my hand. Because it gives you that customizability. I mean, I think that out of all the Final Fantasy games that, like, I don't know, you probably have the same experience as me where you haven't played that game in months. You boot the game up and you look at your save file. This one, I'm like, what was I doing again? Was I trying to get 100 demis early? Was I trying to get the Lionheart on disc 1? Was I trying to do this? Like, it's a lot more customizable. So you're like, what was my strategy here? Why did I only have 10 of that spell? What, was I an idiot? Or was I trying something else and wasn't focused on that? Whereas with, like, Final Fantasy IX, you can go, it's obvious what I was doing, because it's like there's only really one way you can do it. 7's a little bit customizable like that. Like, or maybe I'll just, like, max out all the materia first, or I'll get the Omni Slash from disc 1 like a lunatic. You can do that sort of stuff. But with 8, there's so much of that stuff. You can go, right, like, pretty much, like, I think you can get massively overpowered before you leave the Balam Island. Like, there's a video I watched where there's a secret draw point in the tunnel.
Oh,
yeah. Like, it's like a further level magic, and you could basically, like, let the draw point recharge, and then you could get that high level magic and just use it. And it's like, why would you break the game? It's quite interesting. It's difficult to really go into detail about it because the junction system is great. I haven't got, like, a real problem with it, but I can understand why people don't like it because it is customizable. And I think the way that the game's set up, it doesn't really do a good job of narratively giving you and explaining the system as you go. I think that's what they were trying to do with the Dollet mission. I talked about this before, where in the demo, it shouts at you, this is how you do, this is how you draw magic, this is how you do that. And I think the idea originally don't know this for certain, was that the Dollet mission was going to be the opening, and you basically just attack with Sifa and then draw magic with the other two. And maybe he'd tell you to draw magic, and you'd, like, stock up on your magic and then have a bunch of magic you could then use for the rest of the game. I don't think they were trying to get you to sit there for 20 minutes drawing all the cure spells from caterpillars in the flipping forest. I think that's just something that everyone just did because they thought it was the only way to get the magic. I think the idea is you're supposed to get the bulk of your magic on your training course, and maybe there would have been a narrative thing to say, make sure you draw as much magic as you can while you're there, and that would have made it a bit easier for people to grasp. Once you get to the point where you can refine items into magic, you don't draw ever again, really, unless you draw GFs. Or maybe triple off Odin or something like that. But most of the time you draw at the beginning and then never draw again. Yeah,
see, I can't disagree, because the way that the game is set up now... I don't know, actually, like, the way that the game is set up now, there is a fair amount of tutorial in the beginning, and I feel like if they'd added to that, it would have been too much, is the problem.
Yeah, but it's so like, you're at school, here's a lesson. It's not like in the narrative of the game where, like, for example, there's a little bit of it where, like, you're in battle and Christus goes, I'll use the R1 trigger to strike, or when Sifa shouts at you in battle and says,
about the EXP,
the last person that kills the monster gets most of the EXP. I think the idea with Dollet, which you can see in the demo, there's a little bit more of that, and I think the idea was that their starting battles would be a bit more tutorial based, where those tutorials will be taught to you in battle. It's difficult because the junction system happens outside of battle, so it's harder for them to put that across. And I think they were going for that kind of school days vibe of, like, just go to your panel. And I'm like, why would I want to flip and sit there and read a tutorial and have a lesson? I want you to tell me how it works. And I think that's where Tactics is similar, because you have to read those tutorials to really understand what the fuck is going on. And it falls down a little bit because of that, because it is awkward just reading through menus, and I'm like, I don't understand this. This doesn't make any fucking sense. And I think another problem with those tutorials with Quistis is that when she shows you those tutorials, she doesn't show you with the magic you have. Like, you start the game, or maybe you get it off the mission, with some magic to start with, and you could play with that magic. Like, you've got given 40 fire spells, or 40 blizzard spells, or 40 thunder spells. Then Quistis could go, oh, what have you got? And you could then show me, tell me. She turns around and she goes, this is the magic you can use, and you go in and do the same thing. That probably would have worked a lot better than her going, oh, you want a junction sleep to your defense. Like, well, I haven't got any fucking sleep. Where do I get sleep from? Like, it's I think that's a lot of the problem, is that it doesn't do it with the stuff you actually have. It does it with, like, imaginary concepts. If they'd have been more aligned with, go into this battle scroll and draw 20 of this particular spell, and I'll show you how that's used. Like in Pokemon, I don't know if you've ever played Pokemon, where it's like Professor Oak takes you into the...
I grew up in the 90s, come on, of course.
No, I know, but you didn't play
Pokemon.
well, the first Pokemon games where you like go into the long
Silver's
grass
my bread and butter, man.
Nah, that's the first, is it? Like, I'm talking about the first Pokemon games where you go into the long grass and like Professor Oak throws a Pokeball at the Pokemon and catches it, right? That sort of shit. Then that might be Pokemon Yellow exclusively, right? Where he shows you how the game works by fucking taking you and going, this is what you do. And then you then keep that Pokemon that he's shown you, as opposed to, I'm going to show you a tutorial about these spells that you don't have access to yet, lol. Oh, and by the way, this is how Zell's Limit Break works, lol. Like, it's fucking, it's like, no, like...
Read the magazines, you pleb.
yeah, like, there's magazines you might not find unless you flip and check every screen. So it's sort of like presented a bit clunkily.
Skew
and I just think that that's probably a symptom of, I think they probably went, Dollet's going to be the opening, and they went, no, let's not make Dollet the opening, let's make it a really weird opening cinematic, which I can't sing the praises of enough, because the opening cinematics of this game is fucking the tits, right? It's amazing, right? Don't care what anyone says, it's a brilliant opening. I've watched that so many times. Brilliant. Okay, so that's probably it for us on Final Fantasy VIII. It's not it for us on Final Fantasy VIII, it's it for this episode of Final Fantasy VIII. So, where can everyone find you online, Mol?
As usual, I can be found at Adramelech on both Twitter and Blue Sky. I do try to remember to actually look at it occasionally. I can't guarantee that I'll get around to it anytime soon, but I do try, I promise. And of course, EXP Required can be found on both Twitter and Blue Sky as at EXP Required. Jack, what about yourself?
So I can be found on Twitter at JackMullen8, and I can be found on Blue Sky at JackieBoy34 and JackieBoy34 everywhere else. YouTube EXP Required as well. You can watch some of our other stuff on there and listen to our podcast there if you're not already listening to it there at the moment. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, everyone.
I enjoyed the chat, Mol, as usual.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.